Ever heard of Gaijin Twitter?
Sounds intriguing. What is it?
It's not just some confusing Japanese hashtag or anything like that. It's actually a really cool online community. A bunch of podcasters, and they're all super passionate about Japan. And they've kind of come together in this digital space.
So they're using this platform to talk about Japan.
Yeah. But here's the really interesting part. They don't just talk about Japan. They talk about podcasting itself, too.
Meta, I like it. I can see why you wanted to deep dive into this.
Right. It's like this fascinating intersection of cultural exploration and like the whole art of podcasting. The article we're looking at today calls it the Gaijin Twitter Podcast Collective.
Okay, so what kind of stuff are they actually talking about?
Well, first off, I was blown away by how diverse this group is. We're talking different backgrounds, different interests, different approaches to podcasting. Like, you've got John Quinn.
Yeah.
He hosts a podcast called Ohazasu,
Yeah.
Japan podcast.
Yeah.
And he's all about this really positive, upbeat take on life in Japan. Everyday experiences, interesting cultural observations. He even throws in some language learning stuff.
That's cool.
Yeah, it sounds really fun. Then there's Joe, who's way up in Ishikawa Prefecture.
See, even geographically, it's diverse. We're not just stuck in Tokyo.
Exactly. And Joe's playing with that a bit with his podcast title, Ishikawa Summit to See.
Clever.
I know, right? A little play on words. But beyond the geography and the podcast names, it's the personalities that really shine through in this article.
I can imagine. So tell me about another one of these podcasters that caught your attention.
Okay, so there's this one called Paprika Girl. And in her bio, she describes herself as a happily weird grandma at heart.
Well, that's relatable.
Right. But what I found really cool is how she blends her love for Japanese culture, like kimonos and tea ceremonies, with her own, unique background.
It's like you don't have to shed your own identity to appreciate it and engage with a different culture.
Totally. And that really comes through in the collective as a whole. It's not just about, like, becoming Japanese or anything like that. It's about exploring how your own perspective shapes your experience of Japan.
It adds so much more depth and nuance than a singular narrative ever could, right?
Absolutely.
And I bet that makes their content so much richer and more interesting.
And Paprika Girl is really just one example. There are so many other interesting voices in this collective. Like, we've got Kevin O'Shea. He calls himself the Canuck in Asia. Pretty catchy, right?
I've heard that one before, yeah.
And he seems to be involved in everything. Exploring nature, travel, even education and gardening. You name it.
Wow, he's got a lot going on.
He does. Then there's this other podcaster. He's like this retired Australian coach. And he's got this podcast called Weekly Fascination, which I love, by the way, where he just shares these amazing stories from his life.
It's incredible the range of backgrounds and experiences you find in this collective.
I know, right? It's like a microcosm of like global perspectives all drawn to Japan.
Right.
And the diversity doesn't stop there. There's even this podcast, The Bean Pod.
Okay, what's that one about?
So it's hosted by this guy named Casey. And get this, his co-host is a hen.
Wait, a hen? Like a chicken?
Yes. A real live chicken. I'm not kidding.
You've got to be kidding me. That's wild.
Right. You can't make this stuff up.
Okay, now I'm even more curious about this collective. It's like, on the one hand, they're all connected by this shared interest in Japan, but then they each bring these completely unique elements to the table.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just about Japan. It's about these individual personalities and their unique approaches to podcasting.
Speaking of podcasting, did you notice how much of the chatter on Gaijin Twitter is actually about podcasting itself?
Oh, yeah. I was going to bring that up. It's like they're constantly talking shop, debating different aspects of podcasting, sharing tips, recommending equipment. It's actually really cool to see.
It reminds me of those behind-the-scenes conversations you get in any creative field.
Yeah.
Like musicians talking about gear or writers geeking out over grammar.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like they're letting us peek behind the curtain of their creative process.
And that makes them feel so much more relatable,
Totally.
It's like they're not just these polished voices on a podcast. They're real people figuring things out as they go.
And one of the big debates they seem to be having is this whole unscripted versus structured episode format. To plan or not to plan? That is the question.
Ah, the eternal struggle.
Right. And it's interesting to see how different podcasters approach this.
Yeah, some people thrive on that spontaneity while others prefer to have every detail mapped out.
Exactly. And there's no right or wrong answer, really. It's just about finding what works best for you and your podcast.
Exactly. And I imagine that leads to some interesting discussions within the collective.
Oh, I bet it does. And they don't just talk about the content of their podcasts either. They get into all the technical stuff, too, like microphones, sound editing software, all that jazz.
Ah, the tools of the trade.
Right. And it's clear they're all really passionate about creating high-quality audio. They're constantly sharing tips and tricks, recommending equipment. It's actually really inspiring to see.
It really speaks to a culture of collaboration rather than competition, which is so refreshing.
Right. It's like they're all in this together. They want to see each other succeed, and they're willing to share their knowledge and experience to help make that happen.
Absolutely. It's about lifting each other up and elevating the craft of podcasting as a whole.
Exactly. So we've established that this community is bursting with personality. They've got this shared passion for both Japan and podcasting. But what's the bigger picture here? What's the ultimate aim of this Gaijin Twitter podcast collective?
Well, they actually talk about this pretty openly in the article. They want to, like, I don't know, deepen the global understanding of Japan.
Now, that's an interesting goal, especially with this kind of platform. I mean, you've got this diverse group, each with their own experiences and perspectives, and they're coming together to present a much more nuanced and multifaceted picture of Japan, not your typical, cherry blossoms and bullet trains kind of thing.
It's like they're challenging those stereotypical narratives we often see, right?
Exactly. It's about the everyday lives of the people who live there, their
Yeah.
challenges, their triumphs, their passions, the real stuff. And because they're sharing these personal stories, these individual journeys, it creates this space for genuine cross-cultural understanding and empathy, don't you think?
Absolutely. And it makes you think, right, what other hidden gems are out there in the podcasting world? What other niche communities are using this medium in innovative ways? Not just to talk about their interests, but to connect, to create, to spark these kinds of conversations.
It's really inspiring. And it just goes to show you, no matter how niche your interests might seem, there's an audience out there for everyone.
Exactly. And in a world that's so often dominated by algorithms and mainstream media, it's those authentic, passionate voices that can really cut through the noise.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the fascinating world of the Gaijin Twitter podcast collective. Hopefully you've learned a thing or two about this unique corner of the podcasting world, but more importantly, we hope you've come away with a sense of the power of community, the importance of diverse perspectives, and the never-ending quest for deeper understanding. So go on, get out there, find your tribe, and who knows, maybe you'll even start your own podcast.
And if you do, make sure you let us know. We'd love to check it out.
Absolutely. Until next time.